Oh, good afternoon, good morning again to everybody joining us. It seems like numbers are stabilizing more or less now, so those who were waiting to join us have filtered in, and others I'm sure will join us in just a moment. My name's Simon Rawson. I'm the Deputy Chief Executive of ShareAction, and it's a great pleasure to host this webinar this afternoon. We are joined by some of my colleagues from ShareAction, Dan Howard and Ruan from our Good Work team. We're also joined by a great friend and ShareAction alum, Rachel Hargreaves, who now works with Uni Global Union, and also by a great friend and ally, Sarah Murphy from the Shareholder Commons. I will allow each of them to introduce themselves when they speak. The format for today's webinar is that we're going to have essentially 3 short presentations and then time for Q&A. So the plan is that the presentations will take about 30 minutes and that we'll have the remaining time for Q&A and discussion with the speakers that we have today. The Q&A function is open and you're welcome to pose the questions at any time. The speakers might pick them up as they're going through, but broadly we're planning to have the Q&A after each of the speakers has had a chance to speak. The topic for our webinar is, of course, addressing the systemic risk of low pay, addressing the systemic risk of inequality. And we'll have 3 perspectives on that. We'll have the perspective from Dan about ShareAction's work on living wages in the UK. We'll have a union perspective from Rachel at Uni Global. And then we will have a system stewardship perspective from Sarah Murphy at the Shareholder Commons, based on a brilliant new briefing that the Shareholder Commons has published today, setting out a proposed guardrail for the systemic risk of low pay. I guess the context for this, I don't really, I suspect, need to tell anybody on this call. The high-level structural nature of inequality today make it an urgent systemic risk, one that's threatening not only individual communities or companies, but entire societies and economies. Inequality is eroding trust in our political systems and our economic system. It's unraveling the social fabric, fueling civil and political unrest. It's increasing the damage that crises like COVID-19 and climate change are causing. It's constraining economic growth, and it's undermining our collective capacity to tackle complex global challenges. Businesses are increasingly recognizing the risk it poses to them. And in that context, I want to hand first to Dan.
Thank you, Simon. I'm Dan Howard. I'm the head of good work at ShareAction. For those of you that don't know, ShareAction is a responsible investment NGO with offices in London and Brussels, and we work to build a world where the financial system serves our people and its planet. And we work with investors in 2 ways. Firstly, we hold investors to account for their impacts through our benchmarks and rankings. And secondly, we work with investors to drive greater corporate accountability on specific thematic topics where we think we can drive accelerated impact. And one of these areas is what we call good work, which includes our campaign on the living wage. In our good work program, we coordinate an investor coalition, which has 46 members made up of asset managers and asset owners with 4.2 trillion in assets under management and advisory. And we work with these investors to participate in collaborative engagements with companies on topics such as paying the real living wage. In my time today, I'm going to very briefly speak through what is a living wage and look at some of the established living wage campaigns that exist today. Speak briefly about the impact of sub-living wages and the effects they have on workers, and then finally speak a little bit to ShareAction's engagement with companies on the living wage. So In terms of defining a living wage, the living wage is a contested concept, and there are a variety of methodologies to define what should and should not be included in its calculation. It's not the purpose of what we want to do today to get into the intricacies of those methodologies. And I think at a general level, it is accepted that a living wage should be defined as a wage level that is sufficient to enable workers to afford a decent minimum standard of living. It's important to note that we're not talking about either a minimum wage that's set by the government, and we're also not talking about a wage that guarantees a very high income that allows for very high discretionary spending. We're talking about a wage that ensures that workers have enough to meet their everyday needs and avoid falling into poverty. The most established living wage calculation and certification is here in the UK. So in the UK, the campaign for a real living wage was started by community leaders in 2001. This led to the establishment of the Living Wage Foundation in 2011, who oversee the calculation of the living wage rate and accredit businesses to the living wage standard. In the UK, there are now over 14,000 accredited living wage employers, and nearly 500,000 workers receive a pay rise as a result of companies making a commitment to the living wage. And I was at an event this morning on the living wage, and they said that 1 in 9 workers in the UK now work for an accredited living wage employer, which I think is a quite impressive stat, given the campaign started 20 years ago in community centres in East London. Something that's important to note as well for the living wage standard in the UK is that this includes payment of the real living wage to third-party contracted workers. So this is really important because over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase in the practice of outsourcing the lowest pay roles, think of cleaning, catering, security, to third-party providers of labour. So when accounting for their impact on workers, companies need to take responsibility for the pay and conditions of workers who, whilst they're not directly employed, contribute to their business every single day. And this week actually is Living Wage Week in the UK, and just recently the new living wage rates were announced. So these are now £12 an hour for workers in the UK and £13.50 for workers in London. And this is compared to the national living wage, which is the minimum wage for over 23s, of £10.42. So there's quite a substantial gap at the moment between the real living wage and the minimum wage in the UK. Something else important to note here in the UK context is that given that the campaign for a real living wage is perhaps most kind of established and solidified in the UK, that the voluntary real living wage movement has placed real upwards pressure on minimum wage policy in the UK. So in 2016, the UK government introduced the national living wage, which is, as I just mentioned, effectively a minimum wage for over 23s. And whilst this rate, despite its name, is not based on the cost of living, increases to the minimum have resulted in significant increases to lowest paid workers over the past 7 years. So the minimum wage rate has increased over 9% in each of the last 2 years. So whilst we would say this rate is still insufficient, it shows that voluntary company action can and does have an upward impact on policy, and really emphasises why it is important for both investors and companies to take action. Beyond the UK, there's living wage calculations and accreditations are developing in other countries, such as the US, Canada, and New Zealand. To compare the UK to the US for just a minute, in the US, we've seen very little progress on minimum wage. The gap still stands a lot greater than it does in the UK. The US federal minimum wage is currently $7.25, whilst the average living wage, as calculated by researchers at MIT, stood at $25.02 last year for a family of 4 with 2 working adults and 2 children. And although many states have minimum wage laws that go above the federal minimum, these are still below what we would class as a living wage rate. So the highest state minimum wage is currently $17 per hour, which again is some distance behind what we would deem to be a real living wage. So I think, yeah, it shows in the US that there's been a reliance on market mechanisms to determine wage levels, but this is leaving millions of workers without a wage that enables them to have a decent standard of living. And as is demonstrated by the UK context, voluntary action by businesses and investors acting in their own long-term self-interest can help to raise minimum wage standards and reduce in-work poverty. At a global level, there's also increasing appetite from multinational companies to take action on the living wage. Recently, the UN Global Compact launched their Forward Faster agenda that includes advancing living wages as one of their 5 pillars. And obviously, it's key. The living wage agenda is key to advancing progress towards the SDG goals. So I guess that's the context in terms of where we are on some of the living wage campaigns that we see at the moment. But it's also important to note that this isn't a detached topic that can be isolated from real people's lives. And the last 2 years have seen significant increases to the cost of living, which have disproportionately impacted the lowest paid workers. This is because they spend a larger proportion of their income on essential goods and services that have increased more in price. In the UK, what this has meant is that 60% of workers earning below the real living wage have had to use a food bank in the past year, and 39% are falling behind on household bills and are regularly skipping meals for financial reasons. So that's the impact that payment of below living wages is having on workers. And I think this is not a state of affairs that is working. It's not working for workers, it's not working for the economy, and it's not working for investors. Current levels of in-work poverty not only put individuals under significant financial pressure and stress, but place a greater burden on the state to pick up the pieces, both in terms of social security and health costs, and undermine the economic and political stability that is essential for businesses and investors. As Simon mentioned, ShareAction has been taking action on living wages, working with investors for a number of years. And the Good Work coalition of investors that we work with has demonstrated the impact that asset managers and asset owners can play. The engagement of our coalition has had a powerful influence in raising pay and standards in the UK. Over half of the FTSE 100 companies now pay a real living wage and are living wage accredited employers. This has risen from only 2 in 2003, so that's gone up substantially, and as it resulted in £89 million going to the pockets of low-paid workers and additional wages. But the problem of low pay remains stubborn in the UK. The lowest paying sectors such as retail and hospitality remain resistant to committing to providing a real living wage in the long term. And that's why last year we at ShareAction coordinated the first living wage shareholder resolution at Sainsbury's, calling on them to become an accredited living wage employer. This resolution was supported by over 100 individuals and 10 investor co-filers at the outset, and a number of investors supported the campaign by publicly pre-declaring their intention to vote in favour. And although Sainsbury's stopped short of becoming a real living wage employer, we think the revolution was successful for 2 reasons. Firstly, the process resulted in 19,000 Sainsbury's workers receiving a pay rise. And the resolution secured 17% of the vote, which included support from a number of investors from outside of our formal Good Work coalition. And secondly, it set a precedent for investor action on the living wage. This was the first resolution on the topic, and it sent a clear signal to companies that paying a living wage is a minimum expectation, and investors will use all the tools at their disposal to ensure that companies implement fair and sustainable workforce practices. And if we are to address the problem of income inequality, we need to see investors increasing their ambition to engage with companies in ways that promote progress on the real living wage. So just to sum up, I think as Simon spoke about at the outset, income inequality poses a risk to the economy and society, and by extension, diversified investor portfolios. And it's clear that current levels of inequality are undermining economic and political stability. It's in the interests of investors and workers to ensure that everyone earns a living wage that allows them to have a decent standard of living. In order to achieve this, we need to see investors engaging with companies on their remuneration strategies and guaranteeing a living wage. I think what the research from the Shareholder Commons shows us is that this isn't just it's not a nice to have. This is actually in the material interest of our societies and economies. Back to you, Simon.
Dan, thanks very much. And as you say, we're here to learn from Sarah about the power of system stewardship and about how we can make a compelling case that is in all of our interests to address the risks of inequality. But you also made an important point that at the center of this are workers who are working for low pay in insecure work. And I'm really delighted that we have Rachel Hargreaves from Uni Global Union with us today. The Global Union representing more than 20 million workers in the services sectors across more than 150 countries, I believe. So Rachel, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Nice to be here with you this afternoon. So just a bit more background on Uni Global. So when we say we cover the skills and services sectors, that includes ICTS, retail, care, post and logistics, cleaning and security, and finance itself. And we, as a global union federation, bring together unions in those sectors as our members. And one of our key roles is to correspond to the global nature of multinational companies through having global level social dialogue. Today, I'm going to speak a little bit about the impact low pay and insecure work has on workers. And then I will also speak about the relationship between unions and inequality and how workers being able to exercise their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining are essential to address income inequality. So Dan touched on some of the impacts of low pay in the UK. Today, I just wanted to pull some examples of the impact that we've seen across a few of our sectors. So on the next slide, firstly, starting with the care sector, it's a sector where low pay is really prevalent. Amongst OECD countries, care workers' hourly wages are 12% lower than the average. So Uni surveyed over 3,000 care workers in 37 different countries, and over half of those respondents said their pay did not allow them to adequately secure basic needs such as housing, food, transportation. And what we also hear from workers is that low pay is really reducing the attractiveness of working in the sector, and that this is contributing to a staffing shortage crisis. And 48% of those workers said that staffing shortage was their top concern. And when we speak to them, they talk about how this impacts their ability to deliver high quality care, but also the impact it has on their workload, stress, and physical and mental health. Another sector we represent where low pay is really prevalent is cleaning. And what we hear from workers here is because of the low pay, they are often forced to work multiple jobs and shifts to earn enough money, or they are forced to take night shifts as they are paid more. We did a similar survey, this time of over 2,500 cleaners who all work night shifts, and 7 out of 10 of them said they worked night shifts because they had no choice because of that economic pressure. And the survey responses also highlighted the negative impacts that night shifts had in terms of isolation, difficulties in maintaining relationships, looking after children, and the impact on poor sleep had on their health as well. And one final example, retail. One of our affiliates, the SDA, who represents retail workers in Australia, has done some work with their members. And what has come up time and time again as one of their biggest concerns is around fulfilling their unpaid care responsibilities whilst having this job, whether that's being able to afford to pay for care or the impact scheduling and rotas can have on trying to make those care arrangements. I picked those examples as they showed the impacts of low pay and insecure work, but I think it also highlights how it can materialize in slightly different ways across different sectors. And that's one reason it's so important that workers themselves are involved in efforts to raise pay or to make changes to insecure contracts, as they really are best placed to know what they need and also actually to know what a company needs from an operational point as well. Therefore, it's really vital workers are able to exercise their rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, and that investors support those rights in stewardship. Freedom of association and collective bargaining are what we call enabling rights, as they can foster respect for other rights, for example, to allow workers to better protect their own rights on health and safety. They also, of course, allow workers to negotiate things such as pay and other terms. So when we look at the impact unions have on wages and inequality, we know that an average worker covered by a union contract earns more than a similar non-union peer. The data differs by country, but as one example, in the US, it's 13.2% higher than a non-union worker. Union members are also more likely to have protections such as paid sick leave. And these benefits of unionisation, we see that they extend beyond the worker themselves. So the OECD research has also found that union density amongst lower wage earners then also increased the share of earnings to the middle income earners. We also know unionisation has raised wages in competing non-unionised workplaces, as they must lift pay to be able to attract and retain workers. This is where sectoral or multi-employer bargaining and agreements are really important, especially in low wage or low margin industries. They uplift the lowest wages without putting one company at a competitive disadvantage. So if we go to the next slide, and when we then look at what this means for inequality, we know trade union density and inequality have an inverse correlation. So if we look at this graph, it shows the share of income going to the top 10% in the blue, and the red line shows union density. This is in the US. You can see from the 40s to the 60s, as union density grew, income inequality dropped. But then from the 60s, we have a continuous decline in union density, while the income of that top 10% continued to rise. We see similar things in other countries. For example, in the UK, the share of GDP going to wages shrank from 57 to 49% between 1980 and 2018, whilst we saw union density decline by 30%. And across OECD countries, those with higher collective bargaining coverage tend to have lower wage inequality. Again, particularly this is found in countries where workers are more likely to be covered by sectoral bargaining. And the decline in trade union density is caused by the sort of long-term erosion of workers' rights, both by an increase of aggressive anti-union tactics we see used by companies, and also an increase in a more hostile policy landscape. In the last couple of years, where interest rates have hiked and we've seen many suffer from the impacts of the cost of living crisis, we've also seen companies and policymakers come down hard on workers' rights to unionise. We see companies like Amazon and Starbucks that are now notorious for using anti-union tactics like captive audience meetings. And we've also seen a move to policy changes, such as the UK minimum service bill, that will make it harder for workers in certain sectors to strike. However, we are also seeing a fight back. We've seen an increased enthusiasm for collective action and labour unions. And as you'll all be aware, there's also been an increase in industrial action, which of course then does pose some risk to companies and investors. So it's important for investors to support workers' rights to freedom of association and collective bargaining, as we know the benefits that this can bring, including higher wages and lower inequality. So thank you.
Rachel, thank you so much. There's already a question for you, actually, on sort of disproportionate impacts on female workers, but maybe have a think about that and we'll come back in the Q&A to that. But thanks a lot for the really important perspective on the importance of worker voice in addressing inequality. And that's quite a powerful chart you showed about the sort of correlation there between inequality and unionization. I want to turn now to Sarah Murphy, who is Chief Strategy Officer at the Shareholder Commons. Shareholder Commons is a US-based nonprofit which focuses on systemic stewardship and addressing the systems risks we face and the risks faced by diversified investors. As we have explored our own work on living wages and addressing inequality here at ShareAction, we've increasingly faced challenges from companies and investors about whether there is, in fact, a case on a single company, single entity, single enterprise level to address living wages from a narrow financial perspective at the enterprise level. And I'm really excited about the work that we're doing together with Sarah and her colleagues at the Shareholder Commons to explore whether there's a systems approach we can take to challenging that doctrine. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you, Simon. I'm going to endeavor not to flub this from a technical perspective. And I'm relying on my colleague to make sure that my slides are actually displaying correctly. Okay, so let me just put this on the correct view. All right, wonderful. So thank you to Dan and to Rachel for setting up the topic today. It's really quite helpful to help people understand exactly what we're talking about when we refer to living wage. I would like to now take the discussion to the concept of system stewardship that we advance at the Shareholder Commons. We're going to start by talking about why investors should prioritize systems over companies. We'll talk about how that implies revised tactics when it comes to stewardship. I'll provide you with the sort of top line takeaways from the research that we've just finished publishing this morning, in fact, and then we'll move on to your questions. So moving to the first part, diversified investors must prioritize systems over individual company performance. And let's talk a little bit about why that is. We have seen it's useful to put into place a couple of foundational concepts, even though I think everyone on this call sort of knows all of this information. It's helpful to put it together for the arc of the concept. Most investors are just average everyday savers whose purpose in investing is just not to run out of money before they die. That's the average investor, right? So they're pensioners, they're people with IRAs, 401ks, superannuation funds, whatever the country is you're coming from. And they're trying to avoid destitution. That is their end goal. And the modern investment framework has pulled off really quite an amazing feat on their behalf by diversifying portfolios. And this is done to protect them from all kinds of volatility in the markets and in individual securities. Having done that, what we've seen as a result of this diversification is that the biggest risk to investors comes from systemic threats that undermine the value of the economy itself, not from the idiosyncratic risk that is the risk associated with that's endemic to a single company or sector. They're much more affected by risks that affect the economy as a whole and drag down GDP as a whole. And independent research tends to show that the amount of of their portfolio value that's accounted for by systemic risk is something on the order of 75 to 94%. So it definitely implies a different approach to stewardship when we recognize that fact. So diversified investors who are considering sustainability questions should prioritize the systemic effects of company decisions over and above anything that. Considering a sustainability-linked vote, investors should ask, how will my vote affect overall market return? Because that's what helps investors to meet their financial goals and liabilities. And often the answer to that question will be the same as the answer to the narrow question of what vote will optimize returns at this individual company. So for instance, if you're considering a question of whether to support a shareholder resolution focusing on shareholder rights, the answer might be yes, because those rights will create greater accountability at the company, and the company will then be more likely to protect shareholders' financial interests. So that's good for both the company and for total market returns. But for some sustainability questions, the interests of individual companies are not aligned with their diversified shareholders' interests in optimizing their overall market returns. It's not always the case that what's best for the company is best for the portfolio. And so the natural outcome of that should be that fiduciaries who are working on behalf of diversified investors should be contemplating the systemic effects first in choosing how to vote. So it's important to note also that neither law nor commercial reality constrain shareholder stewardship or advocacy that's designed to preserve or enhance a portfolio's long-term value. If a portfolio company creates social or environmental costs that threaten their overall portfolio returns, investors can and should use their stewardship tools to oppose such behavior, even if doing so could reduce value at an individual company. And of course, this applies beyond low wages and income inequality. You'll see that this slide shows other systemic risks, largely because they're easier to depict visually. So I want to share with you an animation that was made by Dr. Ellen Quigley and her team at Cambridge University. It describes the concepts that I'm talking about in terms of what's known as universal ownership, which is essentially just the highest degree of diversification. Current investment strategies focus on market outperformance, irrespective of a portfolio's real-world impact. Costs individual companies impose on societies, such as greenhouse gas emissions, overuse of antibiotics, or poverty wages, are known as externalities. Individual companies prioritize their own financial returns over externalities, even when doing so threatens the health of vital environmental or social systems. These externalities may increase company returns, but the costs emerge elsewhere in our economic and social systems and in overall portfolio returns. Universal ownership is a way of activating investors as drivers of the transition towards a fully decarbonized and more equitable economy. Universal ownership recognizes that a majority of shareholder value is generated through the performance of the market as a whole, not outperformance of individual companies relative to the market. So that's just a visualization to help us think through what we're talking about here. So at the Shareholder Commons, one of the tools that we propose to advance system stewardship is something we call guardrails. Shareholders can use guardrails to effectuate system stewardship in their activities. And a guardrail is really just a minimum set of parameters of corporate behavior to stop cost externalization that damages social and environmental systems. The stewardship mechanisms that can be used at companies that fail to adhere include votes against directors, votes against going private transactions, and guardrail requirements in IPOs. Investors can also use their influence as limited partners to ensure that private equity, venture capital,
Have others lost Sarah? Yeah, mid-flow. Well, Sarah, we lost you just as you were talking about the role of limited partners.
You lost my audio or you lost the whole thing?
We lost your audio, but the slides are still up, but we lost you when you were talking
Okay.
about the effects of the role of limited partners.
Oh, apologies for that. Yes, so investors can use their influence as limited partners to ensure that private equity, venture capital, and hedge fund sponsors bring portfolio companies within guardrails. And even companies that are not subject to such governance tactics can be affected through their participation in supply chains, which I think is a particularly important thing to keep in mind when we're talking about living wage. And Dan mentioned also that also should apply to contractors and subcontractors in his remarks. So moving then from that, let's talk about how system stewardship requires revised engagement tactics from investors than the ones that we're used to deploying when it comes to ESG integration efforts at individual company level. I think it's important to recognize that corporate leadership is expert in managing enterprise value and risk. And frankly, if they're not managing their own enterprise value and risk well, investors should be voting them out of office and seeing them replaced. That is their job. But corporate leadership is not expert in managing systemic and portfolio risk. Individual companies are internally focused, and they're not structured to address the broad systemic concerns that matter most to diversified investors. Let's consider the example of Amazon, for instance, where the company's labor policies actively encourage high turnover. It may be tempting to argue that this is bad for the company's bottom line because high turnover comes at such an internal cost. But many industry observers believe, and I think Amazon leadership has been fairly candid about the fact that they do this by design because it has the effect of protecting the company from union organizing. So such a decision may be quite rewarding to Amazon's enterprise value, but the contribution to inequality that comes at a high cost to the broader economy is really bad for Amazon's own shareholders' portfolio value. So without concerted pressure from Amazon's investors, its leaders are going to continue to focus only on enterprise value and continue in the vein of their labor practices as currently established. So many investors' policies require extensive and protracted engagement before a proxy action. And we understand why that is. It's to sort of try to see if they can come to agreements with companies on changes that they want to see made at that company. But that type of an approach can be counterproductive to system stewardship. Guardrails that protect diversified portfolios should not be subject to compromise that prioritizes company profits over systemic health. As such, the aim of company engagement should be to ensure that the company is not violating guardrail standards that protect the systems upon which its investors rely. In that case, a protracted negotiation is unlikely to be productive. Gradual escalation strategies don't fit a system stewardship model. Systemic risks to shareholders' diversified portfolios are qualitatively different to the enterprise risks that company-focused stewardship campaigns target. In the latter case, guardrail escalation is often appropriately proportionate to the stakes and reflective of the alignment between shareholder and company interests. In contrast, a guardrail is designed to establish a bright line that protects a vital interest of the company's owners from incursion by a company focused on its own enterprise value. In light of the divergent interests of shareholders and companies, shareholders must send immediate and clear signals that companies must not externalize costs that undermine diversified portfolio value. Support for boards at companies that violate guardrail protections sends the wrong message and delays action on systemic issues that may have materially negative portfolio consequences. Engagement policies often emphasize quiet diplomacy that relies on behind-the-scenes persuasion. Some investors are reluctant to vote against directors because it feels too personal and public. But a failure to quickly and publicly remove boards that fail to protect diversified shareholders signals the wrong thing to the market, and it signals that such behavior is acceptable and allows management to continue to reap rewards for profits that come at the expense of investors' long-term interests. So when system stewardship leads to a vote against a director, it's not an indictment of that person's work or ability. Rather, it's a declaration that the board's focus on company returns is not aligned with the broad interests of the company's diversified shareholders. A significant no vote from shareholders will give the conflicted board the confidence that its shareholders support a system-first approach. There are some pretty good precedents for this approach. For instance, LGIM, Legal and General Investment Management, initiated a campaign in 2022 that engages FTSE 100 and S&P 500 companies that don't have ethnically diverse directors on the board. And LGIM set out its expectations and specified its voting intention, saying that in 2022, it would vote against board members at companies that failed to meet their expectations for ethnic diversity. And more broadly, investors have been steadily increasing their willingness to vote against directors on bases such as these. We also know that vote no campaigns work. Academic studies have shown that few stewardship techniques are as effective as voting against directors. Even PricewaterhouseCoopers, in a document that they wrote for directors to oppose campaigns such as this, acknowledged that vote no campaigns can send a strong signal about shifting shareholder priorities. And crucially, they said that the vote doesn't actually have to fail for a vote no campaign to achieve results. And that even Dr. Ellen Quigley, whom I referenced earlier, has done some work that determined that even just 11.4% support for a vote no campaign can produce a really strong response from companies. So as fiduciaries charged with optimizing returns for clients and beneficiaries, institutional investors can't afford to forego this important tool for preserving portfolio value. And before I move on to the next section, I just want to mention too, we're talking about living wage here today, and the guardrail I described would necessarily be around requiring that companies pay a living wage. But going back to Rachel's presentation, a guardrail itself can be applied to any systemic risk and to any remedy for that risk. So a guardrail could equally be designed around what she described as enabling rights, requiring companies to not interfere with unionization efforts and so on and so forth. This concept applies to all these things. So let me briefly share with you some of the results from the research that we've just released. And I'll move quickly because I want to leave time for your questions. So we found that closing the living wage gap worldwide could add more than $4.5 trillion every year to the global economy through increased productivity and spending. And that equates to a more than 4% increase in annual GDP. And it's worth noting that GDP is a pretty good proxy for diversified portfolio value. We found that poverty and inequality due to low wages reduce economic growth. Raising wages can create macroeconomic growth both directly by adding to aggregate demand and indirectly by boosting productivity. Because lower paid workers have a higher propensity to consume out of income, and this references back to Dan's remarks earlier in his presentation, raises for low paid workers have strong multiplier effects in the economy. Low earners tend to spend more of their increased income than those on higher incomes because those on low incomes have more essential spending needs to be met by any income increases. In our research, we found a couple specific cases in Brazil, Russia, India, and China, the BRICS countries. New models of employment effects of living wages have shown that they stimulate local demand, resulting in job creation. In the UK, if a quarter of low-wage employees were increased to living wages, annual living wage dividend would be £700 per person in London and £730 per person in other local authority areas. Regarding wages and inflation, this is a question that comes up frequently from investors. There's a concern that there's a wage inflation spiral. We pretty well found that that's not a genuine risk. Wage-driven increases in productivity and reductions in turnover defray added costs. Higher wages can be and frequently are paid out of profits and thus don't create inflationary pressure. Providing living wages has a small effect on price change at a global level for most industries. And nominal wages can continue to increase while inflation declines, allowing real wages eventually to grow. When it comes to inequality, we found a positive correlation between income inequality and a host of social and health problems, including reduced life expectancy, incarceration, homicide, crime, and a host of other social ills. We found that income inequality has a sizable and statistically significant negative impact on growth. And specifically, the inequality at the bottom of the distribution has the most significant dampening effect. So the gap between low-income households and the rest of the population matters most in that equation. And sorry, I forgot to highlight one other thing that always sticks in my brain. One of the researchers we cited, who, by the way, was writing in 2017, which is important, described a violent 4 horsemen of leveling inequality. Those are mass mobilization welfare, transformation revolutions, state collapse, and with eerie prescience, since he was writing in 2017, lethal pandemics that have periodically reduced inequalities dramatically because they can lead to the alteration of existing power structures or wipe out the wealth of elites and redistribute their resources. A fairly dramatic and significant thing to contemplate. So let me stop there so we have time for your questions, discussion, and potentially skeptical retorts. And whatever we can't get into here, I would really encourage you to reach out to me and continue the conversation when we're finished. And let me stop sharing here so that we can.
Sarah, thank you very much indeed. Are we going to be able to pop the link to your briefing in the chat, I hope, yes, because it's right now. Oh, excellent, seamless. It's really, I believe, a really compelling case as to why the interests of diversified investors are best served by applying a living wage guardrail, and not only talking about how you would do that, but giving that justification. And we're very excited about the opportunity to test that out, and will be doing, and would encourage anybody on the webinar who's interested in exploring this with us to get in touch. We're working together across the Atlantic to test it, both at UK companies or in the UK economy and across UK sectors, and in the US. But let's turn to some questions, and they're coming in thick and fast. I wanted to go first of all to Rachel, to the question around the disparity in impacts between male and female workers. Do you have any thoughts on that, Rachel?
Yes, so the examples I shared are sectors where there is overrepresentation of females. I actually think cleaning, retail and care are the top 3 sectors where there's no overrepresentation. They're also 3 of the largest sectors where low pay is prevalent, so it is an issue that disproportionately impacts women. Some of those challenges I also spoke about have a disproportionate effect on female workers. For example, the retail workers in Australia that were struggling to balance unpaid care responsibilities. We also know women do a higher amount of unpaid care. I should flag it's not just women that are disproportionately affected. People of colour are more likely to be in in-work poverty, and we see them overrepresented in those sectors. And in care and cleaning in particular, there's a really high proportion of migrant workers. I think it's roughly 30% on average across Europe. So yes, it does disproportionately impact women, but also other groups. And those workers whose identities intersect across multiples of those groups are often the most affected as well.
Yeah, thank you. And Laura, thank you very much for that important question. A question for you, Sarah, goes to the question around how do you recommend quantifying the impact of voting at the detriment of one company to the rest of the portfolio? Can you provide an example where you're able to quantify the sort of overall portfolio benefit of voting to the detriment of one company?
Mm-hmm. It's an interesting question, and it's certainly specific to the incentives that are currently in the market, right? I mean, and I think it goes specifically to metrics that portfolio managers themselves are bound to. So I understand how important it is. The fact of the matter is that attribution in this case is difficult. The way we think about this type of stewardship is that instead of raising the value of a single company, you're raising the value of the benchmark itself. And so what we want to think about in that case is improvements in the economy overall and in raising the benchmark for all investors. And that might be somewhat disappointing, but I think it's the reality. And economically, it is in fact the best approach to support everyday savers.
Makes sense. Dan, maybe a question for you. We have for 10 or more years made the arguments at ShareAction that we believe that it is in the best interest of individual companies to pay living wages. And there's a lot of, we believe, research out there that shows that. And indeed, the Living Wage Foundation, of course, pursues that argument. Do you think that this systems approach contradicts the business benefit argument of paying real living wages?
I mean, I think it's a good question. I'd like to hear Sarah's thoughts on it as well. But I don't think there is a contradiction. I think what we've seen in our engagement with the companies on the living wage is that, as I mentioned, there's some sectors that have been particularly resistant to making movement based on a business case argument. You know, these are business models that are predicated on low pay and are very hard to change. And I think that's why the systems stewardship argument is so interesting, that it does bring a systemic approach to this that doesn't mean you are making the argument to individual companies on business benefits that are often, I guess, a little bit more uncertain and abstract, because they are often, you know, into the future. And I still do think that there are, you know, concrete benefits that businesses can see from high, you know, implement higher wages. I think all the evidence shows that is the case. But I think the systems approach offers an opportunity to engage with companies in the here and now in the interest of their shareholders. So I suppose that's what I say. I don't see it as contradictory. I see it as a different kind of approach we can have. But yeah, Sarah, really keen to hear your thoughts on that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't think it's contradictory. I think it's complementary. There is loads of evidence, of course, that improved treatment of workers and worker pay and so forth has some benefit to companies themselves. There's a sort of range within which that's true. There's also a limit to how far that's true. And at a certain point, how far that's true for an individual company stops. And there's this gap between how much more still needs to happen so as to protect portfolios from broader economic damage. And it's that gap, that's why we talk about the engagement gap in our publication, that we're trying to address. And again, I brought up the Amazon example earlier. There are many corporate boards that have made the very rational calculation that they can squeeze their workers at the margins and do quite handsomely on profits. And so there is a limit to how far that argument takes us. And that's what we're trying to address with this type of stewardship.
Thanks, Sarah. Maybe a quick follow-up for you, Sarah. A question that always comes up, if you sit down and debate the question of how do you address low pay, how do you address inequality, we believe it's an investor action. You might move on to debating and say, well, we believe it's systemic action by investors. And then some people will say, well, that's not the role of investors, that's the role of policymakers. Policymakers should be the one raising the floor on low pay. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I don't know how many people on this call are familiar with Oprah Winfrey, but I will channel her when I say, how's that working for you? The reality is, yes, government is in fact the most rational and effective entity to address some of these systemic risks. And yet look where we are. And Dan described admirably, there's a bad enough gap in the UK. The gap in the US between legally mandated living wages and minimum wages and living wage is ghastly and not about to move. And I think we can account for a lot of that by corporate capture of the political process, frankly. And so in the face of that, it's not to say that we don't want policymakers to address this. We're hopeful that, again, this is a complementary approach. There is precedent for investor action spurring regulatory action. And we hope that this can have that effect as well. But absolutely, investors should be aligning their policy efforts with this type of a strategy. And really, it's about using all the tools in your toolkit.
Yeah, no, we would for sure agree with that. Okay, I'm going to group two questions together and ask both Dan and Rachel to come in on them, if that's okay. One is around workers in supply chains. Herbrand, it's wonderful to have you with us, and you complement our work, but the compliments are mutual for all the work that you lead at the World Benchmarking Alliance. And you mentioned that you assessed 2,000 companies on social inclusion, and you note the difference between the fact they might employ, they directly employ 100 million people, but they might actually be responsible for 1.4 billion workers throughout their supply chains, and that those are often the most vulnerable. So the first question is around any reflections on workers in supply chains, and the sort of not unrelated question is around public contracts. What is the role of government as a buyer and its ability to mandate living wages, I guess, directly and through supply chains? So Dan, do you want to kick off, and then Rachel, do you want to pick up some thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm happy to kick off on that. I mean, I think I'll answer the government one first, maybe, because that's I guess like a little bit simpler to answer based on our experience of working in the UK. I think in the UK we've seen that there's been huge progress from local authorities and devolved governments in their procurement processes, and implementing the living wage as a minimum has had a huge impact on uplifting thousands of workers to the rate. So yeah, working on government procurement and contracting is hugely important. It can help to raise those standards, and the more that businesses that are providing services see that, the more they will do it. More of a challenge at the national government level, because you're less likely to see national government advocating for a wage that they aren't producing themselves. So a little bit more tricky there, but we've seen great progress in more devolved authorities who have a great commitment to providing a real living wage. I think on the supply chain question is a very good one, and very kind of relevant to this discussion. In my presentation, at least, I focused on, I suppose, like the UK primarily, and also spoke about the US. I think that's symptomatic of the fact that this is where we have the best understanding of what a living wage is. And I think that we've seen huge strides in company disclosure when it comes to supply chains, and also are making strides in understanding what a living wage would be across the world in different geographies. However, I think we've still got a long way to go in doing that, but we definitely want to see more companies making the commitment to pay a living wage through their supply chain, because it's only through companies start making that commitment and starting to explore how to do that we can make concrete progress and see that material change. It's my perspective on it, but yeah, over to you, Rachel.
Thanks, Dan. Not a lot to add, but on the public contract point, I agree with Dan. There is a role there to play, and they can set things like wages. Uni Europa, part of Uni Global, are launching a campaign in Europe to make sure that any public procurement contract through any government includes the right to collective bargaining, so that then workers then can bargain for their wages and try and get higher wages, amongst other things. And on the supply chain, a lot of the sectors I spoke about, I did speak about the direct workers, but cleaning, where we see low pay is really prevalent, is often outsourced to other companies. And I know in the UK that then also comes under the living wage accreditation. And I'd also say, again, we have a better understanding in the US, the UK, that's where my presentation focused. But when we work in a lot of those other countries that have the workers that are working in those supply chains, we also see that there is a higher risk to workers organising in those countries, as well as normally lower wages.
Rachel, thank you. And incredibly brief and timely. We've reached 4:30 here in the UK. and I want to bring the webinar to a close. I'll start by thanking the panel, Dan, Sarah, Rachel, and Rune, our colleague who is seamlessly working the tech, and want to commend to you again the work of Sarah and her colleagues at the Shareholder Commons, the briefing that's available and the link that's been posted in the chat. I think that's a compelling basis for adopting system stewardship to address inequality, which can only be the most pressing social challenge we face today, and invite you to come and work with us on it. We are testing these actions. We will be delighted to have supporters from this large group that's on the webinar today. And we will drop you a line if you registered before joining to your email to let you know how you can do that. Thanks very much, and we'll leave you there.